Hello, my name is Sherry Harris. This is my good dear friend Cheryl Klontz, and we are both Methodist pastors. And we are thrilled that you are joining us on this journey through the Scripture. And our deepest prayer is it will lead you into a more profound life of purpose and a deeper relationship with God. We are in the midst of our sermon series about men of the Old Testament, or who we like to call Dirty Rotten Scoundrels. And today we're going to look at probably maybe a surprising choice. We're going to be looking at Samson. And let me tell you up front, Cheryl has, let's see, how can I put this? She has some really distinct opinions about Samson, and they're not always favorable.
Speaking of purpose, I'm not sure what the purpose of Samson is.
Oh, come on, cut the guy some slack.
All right.
But she's gonna get us started on Samson.
I tell you, because it's been a running joke in our family. My kids will even joke, but they'll say, "Who is our favorite character in the Bible?" Samson, because I know that drives me crazy. He appears in children's Bibles. Why in the world this man appears in children's Bibles?
Because we only tell that much of the story.
Yeah, and we're not going to get into all of it, but if you go back like we recommend and read this story, you'll see what I mean. This guy is, of all of our dirty, rotten scoundrels, this is the most scoundrelish.
And so self-absorbed. Oh my goodness.
But he is also found in Hebrews 11 in the Hall of Fame of the saints, through whom we get our faith. But you got to admit that even in the children's version, which is pretty cleaned up.
Oh, it's very cleaned up.
There's a sense of the story. You kind of go, what in the world would that have to do with my life? This guy with all his hair and his strength in his hair, and we'll talk a little bit about that in a minute.
Right.
But what would that have anything to do with our lives? Interestingly enough, it does. But I actually found a purpose for this story.
And I was so proud of her when she got to that point.
Yes. So by the time Samson is found in the book of Judges, and the book of Judges has a definite cycle where it talks about, some people call it a cycle of sin. I like to call it a cycle of grace, where they do what is right in their own eyes. Because of that, they get handed over their enemies. They cry out to God. God hears their cry. He lifts up a judge, and the judge delivers them, and there's peace for a while, and then they do what is right in their own eyes, and it just continues again and again. And what also happens in the book of Judges is it just gets worse and worse and worse.
Spirals down.
It spirals down. So at the beginning, you have judges that are actually quality people.
Deborah, for example.
And by the time you get to the end, you're getting Samson. And in fact, Samson is the last judge, and he breaks the cycle. Things don't happen according to the cycle. He becomes the last judge, and everything really goes downhill from there. So, but yet there is, I promise you, there is a message of hope, and I can't believe I found one.
I know, but we're going to get to it. We're going to get to it.
So tell us about...
Well, the birth of Samson. It's always interesting. There's a phrase that you read a lot in the Bible. Israel continues to do what is right in their own eyes, which means they have really messed up once again. And things get so bad, God decides that God has to act. Now, there are still faithful people, and a man named Manoah and his barren wife, they are faithful. And when you meet a barren wife in the Hebrew Bible, you know God's getting ready to do something. So the Lord's messenger comes to her, tells her that her son will be a Nazarite. Am I saying that right? Nazarite. And Cheryl's going to talk more about that from birth, and that he will begin Israel's rescue from the Philistines. Now, she believes immediately, but her husband doesn't, which kind of reminds me of Mary and Joseph in the New Testament. Mary believes the angel immediately. Joseph has to be convinced.
And Zachariah and Elizabeth.
Absolutely. And also Mary Magdalene believes immediately at the tomb, but the disciples have to be convinced a bit.
In other words, the women get... Oh, sorry. The women get it before the men.
It's okay. We're leaving that one.
Okay.
But anytime you have these kind of miraculous births, the expectations are going to be very, very high. But why don't you tell us a little bit about what these rules are that he's supposed to live his life by?
Because God tells both the husband and wife that they need to be Nazarites till he's born, and then he needs to be a Nazarite from birth. Now, so a Nazarite, it's not a Nazarene, which Jesus was from Nazareth, and he is called Jesus the Nazarene, but a Nazarite is something different. It comes from the word Nazar, which means to abstain from or to consecrate oneself to. And there were like three major rules for a Nazirite. One was no wine. In fact, it wasn't just about the alcohol. You weren't even supposed to get near grapes.
Oh, my goodness.
So you didn't even go to a vineyard, okay? And so Nazirites, no wine, no grapes, no vineyards. You're not supposed to touch anything unclean.
Okay.
Because
that makes you unclean.
That makes you unclean. And particularly like corpses, dead bodies, which will actually come into the story in just a little bit. And you weren't supposed to cut your hair. Now, like I said, for the most part, this was short term. In fact, if you go to the New Testament, you'll find Paul doing this at one time, taking a Nazirite
for a brief
vow.
period.
It's sort of like a Lenten discipline.
Yeah,
You're going to do it for a brief period of time. But now Samson was supposed to do it for the rest of his life. And so his parents taught him all of that. They raised him properly, and the Lord blessed him. And it says that God's Spirit began to move within him. Now, and here's something that's kind of different about how the Old Testament talks about the Spirit of God at work in people's lives from the New Testament. In the New Testament, after Pentecost, we are all granted the gift of the Spirit.
Absolutely.
It is poured down upon us, and it remains with us. But in the Old Testament, there's a sort of a sense of the Spirit coming in and going out.
Right.
Coming in and coming out. And when it would come in powerfully, then it would result in like great acts of strength or ecstatic worship. Like sometimes they were often thought to be drunk when the Spirit
or even possessed.
Or possessed when the Spirit got a hold of them. And so the Spirit of God begins to move within him, and that brings these great feats of power for him, as well as some moments of what appeared to everybody to be craziness.
Right. And there's a little bit of that in his life, too. So the story picks up, Samson's a grown man, and he's traveling from his town to another town, and he sees a Philistine woman. Now, the Philistines are the enemy. We need to remember this. They were a seafaring people. They settled in the coastal regions. Remember David and Goliath? That was a battle between the Philistines and the armies of God's people. So, Samson, to me, at this point in his life, is like this really, really overgrown, strong, not so smart 2-year-old. I mean, he sees this Philistine woman, and it's just like...
No, a 13-year-old.
Oh, 13-year-old. He sees
he's got the hormones going.
Yeah, that's true. Good point. Anyway, he sees this woman, and he says, get her for me. She pleases me. And that's what he tells his parents. And like most parents, they say, isn't there a woman among your own people? I mean, I actually said that to my sons. Can't you just once date a Methodist girl? So I understand that. But Samson is just adamant. But even in the midst of this kind of ludicrous situation, God is already working. And this is where Samson begins to break the vows. He's on his way back to see her, and he kills a lion, this spectacular lion kill. And on the way back, bees have built a hive inside the carcass of the lion, and he scoops honey out from it, which is unclean. He's touched something dead. And he even feeds it to his parents.
It doesn't tell him where it came from.
No. So he's done the same thing. So then there is a big party. I like to think of it as kind of a bachelor party, which we know lots of wine is involved. And Samson, drinking wine, not supposed to, but he is. And he starts bragging about how he killed this lion. And in that particular day and time, they love to use riddles. And so he gives them this riddle: out of the eater came something to eat, out of the strong came something sweet. Well, nobody can guess the riddle, and they're really getting ticked off. And so they convince Samson's wife to kind of con the answer out of him. And she does, and he's furious. And so suddenly this cycle of vengeance and violence breaks out. I mean, Samson attacks the Philistines. His wife is given to another man. He burns down their fields of grain. And then the Philistines burn Samson's wife and her new husband. I mean, it's just horrendous. You need to read the story, a lot more details. Yeah. But the only vow he's still keeping is his hair. He has not yet cut his hair.
Yes. So fast forward 20 years, and we get to the story you know probably the most.
Yes, Delilah.
For some reason, in our children's Bibles, Samson and Delilah. And one of the ways I always heard the story growing up was that the strength was in his hair.
I did too.
And I think it's important to remember the strength was never in his hair. The strength was in God and God's Spirit within him. And the hair was a sign of the vow that had been made to God.
The one he hasn't
The
broken yet.
only one he has not yet broken. So fast forward, it's 20 years later from that first disastrous wedding. And he meets this woman named Delilah. And we're not clear if she was an Israelite or if she was a foreigner. What we do know is that she was apparently a very attractive woman, and she liked to use her feminine wiles.
Yeah, she was a good manipulator.
She was a very good manipulator. And so Samson just falls in love with her. And so the Philistines come to her and says, can you find out what the secret of his strength is? And she goes to him 3 different times and says, tell me what the strength of where your strength comes from. And he lies to her. Well, then she does whatever it is he tells her not to do. She does it. And then she calls the Philistines in to capture him. And it doesn't work because he lied to her.
And you would think at that point he would begin to pick up on what's going on.
If not the first, what's that? Fool me once, shame on you. Fool me twice, shame on me.
Doesn't work
3
with
times.
Samson.
On the 4th time, the 4th time he finally gives in and tells her, well, my strength is in my hair. And so she cuts his hair. The Philistines grab him. They imprison him. They gouge out his eyes. They bind him with shackles. And they assign him doing women's work. The ultimate, but for somebody like Samson, and in that day and age, the
absolutely.
ultimate insult. They assign him women's work.
Now, we've been making a little bit of fun about Samson, but this is really tragic, what has happened to him. But in the midst of this tragedy, we have a word of hope.
Yes.
Because when God's in the story, we always have a word of hope. The hair on his head begins to grow again. And as his hair grows, his strength begins to return because God is giving him that strength back. Now, the Philistines really enjoyed making fun of Samson while he's in this terrible state. And so he commands that he entertains them. And so Samson decides, because he knows his strength has returned, he's going to go out in a blaze of glory. So he asks them to put him in between the 2 pillars at the entrance of their God's temple. And then he calls on God to give him strength and to allow him to die.
And this happens throughout Scripture where people call on God and say, let me die. Like next week when we hear about Jonah.
Oh, my gosh. Yes, absolutely.
But Samson is the only one that God allows to die.
And so God grants his request. And so Samson pulls down the pillars of the temple. Everything comes crashing down. He actually winds up killing more in his death than he actually did in his life. Now, this was the beginning of the rescue of Egypt. But as you've already mentioned, the book of Judges just continues to spiral downward into this kind of descent into vengeance and violence and covenant breaking. But here's the important question. What can we learn from Samson?
And we can learn something.
I'm so proud of you. I'm so proud of you.
So the first is, I think, the obvious, and it really fits with every one of the characters that we're talking about today, and that God chooses to work through fallible human beings.
Absolutely.
We don't have to have our act all together for God to use us. And in fact, sometimes God uses us despite ourselves.
Absolutely. Samson may have been
Samson, I think, was definitely one of those. Even right into, it's in his death that he has his greatest victory. We'll hear that later in a different story in a whole different way with Jesus.
Absolutely. Much better.
Much better. Much better. But so God works through fallible human beings. The other thing you find is, and I forgot to mention this when we were talking about Samson and Delilah, one of the saddest moments in the story to me actually is not the gouging out and the imprisonment, but when she cuts his hair and he wakes up, it says he did not realize that the Spirit of God had left him.
Oh.
And it reminds me that we can harden our own hearts to God's Spirit, that we can say no to God so many times that we don't even realize that we no longer feel the Spirit of God within us. Now, luckily, God shows back up.
Always.
God always shows back up. But we have a responsibility to be open to God, to keep our promises to God, to give God the space so that we know that God's Spirit is with us. So we can harden our hearts, but we don't have to.
No.
And God, and also the God will actually work through this.
Oh, and the other thing I think that's so important because of this, I mean, God is just crazy in love with us. It's this reckless love of God.
So one of the things I read about the story that really has changed my perception of this whole story is actually the concentration on the story of Delilah. No matter how many times she betrayed him, he went back to her again and again and again. And one of the scholars I read, one of the commentaries I read, said perhaps in Samson's willingness to go back again and again to the person that has betrayed him, to the person that does not love him like
the person who's trying to hurt him
actively trying to hurt him, the person that does not want the better for him. He shows us the love of God for us, the reckless love of God that keeps coming back to us again and again and again and again, despite our unworthiness.
Wow. I love that. And I am so happy you found something redeemable in the Samson story.
And something that can give us all a life of
Oh,
purpose.
I think so. I think so. This story speaks so strongly into our own lives. And this is not a story we need to leave in the children's department. This is our story because, I mean, that's why we're believers. We want a life of purpose. And believe it or not, we find some of this in Samson.